Hello. I think that one of the most popular books in the Old Testament must be the book of Ruth, even though it's not really the most important book in the whole of the story. And I think one of the most treasured lines in the whole of that book is that line where Ruth acknowledges that her new relationships put her in a completely different place with regard to where she belongs. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. The idea that being with God makes a new people out of us. It's an idea picked up in the letter of Peter, where he says, once you were no people, but now you are a people. Once you didn't know mercy, but now you know mercy, the mercy of God. As Methodists, we too are one people, one Methodist family set within the whole of the Christian family. And one of the things that's interesting about Methodists, distinctive about Methodists, is the fact that we are both encouraged to be separate and get on with things in our own place, and also to see ourselves as together. As Wesley travelled around the country, he said to different places, what is the work of God in this place? But at the same time, he coined the word connectional, suggesting that we form one web of interconnected work for God. We see that sometimes if we go to different churches on a Sunday. In some churches, you'll find the same thing happening pretty well all over the place. But in other churches, in Methodist churches, you might find a very traditional liturgy, or you might find a very non-traditional service. You might find very traditional organ music. You might find a very non-traditional band accompanying it. The Methodist movement is both local and national, contextual and connected. The last 18 months have been difficult for us as individuals and as churches. And mostly we've experienced that where we are. It's been quite difficult to see ourselves as part of a bigger picture sometimes. Sometimes it's been quite difficult to see beyond our own living rooms as different lockdowns have taken hold. And sometimes it's been difficult to see beyond what we need to do because of the next wave of COVID. But things have been going on in the world, and some of those things affect us as a Methodist community and as a connection. So, although it's a difficult time for us to come to churches to talk about money, that's what Matt and Sonia need to do now. Talking about how, as one Methodist family, we are called to respond to the new way that things are in the world.
So Matt, at conference we heard a lot about the pension reserve. So could you just tell me what the pension reserve is and why it's important and who is it important to?
So the pension reserve, it's a fund under the control of the conference that's available to make payments to the pension schemes as and when any deficits might emerge. And it's largely funded from property levies. So whenever mansas or churches get sold, there's a levy that's taken, and some of that's put into the pension reserve fund. And it's really important because it gives the church a means of funding its obligations to the pension schemes. And those are sort of the legal obligations that we have. And also the pension trustees then know that they've got the money that they need in order to pay the pensioners.
So it's a legal requirement, but is it also a moral requirement for us as Methodist members?
Absolutely it is. If we just did things for legal reasons, we'd get nowhere, would we? There's a moral obligation there for us to pay pensions. But also, I think there's also that covenant relationship between the church and its ministers. And I think ensuring that pensions are paid during retirement is obviously part of that bond between church and those that serve it.
Thank you. So we don't want to end up a bit like Debenhams or one of these other big names where there's no money in the pension. Is that what you're saying to us?
Absolutely. But of course, because of all the scandals with many of those big companies, the whole legal framework around pensions has been changing. And that's another factor that's playing into how we're having to deal with things going forward.
Because we're used to companies saying that there's not enough money in the pensions, and it's usually because it's been mismanaged. Is that the problem for the Methodist Church? Have we mismanaged our money?
We haven't, but there is a deficit that's arisen at this valuation. And valuations have to be done every 3 years. And sometimes there'll be a surplus, and sometimes there'll be a deficit. And you can't sort of pick and choose which one you like, you know. So if there's a deficit this time, we have to look at that and deal with that, even though there's particular circumstances that have created that deficit. Because, of course, when there's a surplus, we kind of accept that. So with this one, yes, I mean, it is true that we had to do the valuation in the midst of the pandemic, which wasn't a great time in terms of valuing the investments. But we've got to deal with the consequences, as I say. And the other thing to say is that because we've got the pension reserve fund, we actually have the money already set aside for the deficit that's arisen. So what we're talking about here is not paying this deficit. We've got the money because those that went before us put in place the arrangements that there would be a pension reserve fund. Mm-hmm. So that's really great. So we did the right things and we've got the money. This is about now looking ahead and saying, well, if we use all the money now that's in the pension reserve to pay this deficit, what does it look like going forward? And we kind of need to top up that fund sort of relatively quickly, and we need to do that now.
But Matt, we've all seen the fall in the stock market. We've all seen that, and we've seen it being bounced back now as we come out of COVID. So surely that money will come in anyway. So why do we need to worry about it now? Can't we just wait and know that in the next 3 years, the valuation will go up again?
Well, I think if we've learned anything from the pandemic, it's that we don't know what the future holds.
We don't.
And of course, most of us would say in the long run, markets will rebound, they'll improve, and all will be well. But unfortunately, we've seen in the last 18 months what can happen, and we don't know what the next 6 months is going to bring, let alone the next 2, 3, 5 years. But also, from the trustees' perspective, they have a legal responsibility to make sure that they've got the funding they need to pay the pensions going forward. And they can't just sort of sit around and wait for markets to improve and hope and pray maybe. They've actually got to put kind of solid measures in place to make sure they can meet their legal obligations.
So we're trying to protect ourselves today for what's going to happen or could happen in the future, just as people have done in the years before in the Methodist Church.
Exactly. That's all we're trying to do. Plan ahead, be sensible, and set aside some money now. And there's a couple of other reasons why it's particularly relevant at this time. Firstly, I've already mentioned that change in the sort of legal kind of framework. There's a new Pensions Act this year, and whilst all the regulations aren't agreed yet, we know the direction of travel for pensions, and that's about reducing risk. So there's a lot of pressure on the trustees to reduce the investment risk that they're carrying, which means they'll start to invest in sort of less risky investments, which might sound like a sensible thing to do, but of course with that comes lower returns in the long run. But if there's lower returns in the long run, that means we as the church will have to pay more, to ensure these pensions are paid in future. We need to give reassurance to the trustees that should there be problems in future, or if the investments do fall, that we as the church have got the money to kind of stand behind the pension schemes. And if we do that, that reassurance that we give them helps them think, well, maybe we can keep a little bit of extra risk on the investments for a little bit longer, or maybe at a slightly higher level than they would do otherwise, which means in the long run, we as the church will be paying that little bit less. So it's about setting aside money now, but actually in the long run, paying less.
Okay, so for instance, I'm just trying to think about it in normal terms for me.
Yeah.
If I had a roof that had a hole in it, a little hole, just a tiny hole, not much water's coming through there. What you're saying to me is, you look after that hole now, Sonia, and it won't be the whole roof that comes off in a few years' time. Is that what you're saying to me?
A brilliant analogy. Maybe you should be sat here.
Now, at conference, I heard that the conference was asked in the churches and circuits to give 15% of their money to the pension reserve. Now, we all know we've all just come out of a pandemic. Lots of churches are only just starting to get back on their feet. And they're thinking 15% is a lot of money. They have a lot of financial commitments on the ground. Why should they give 15% of their money to this? Why should they bail out the connection, is what they're all thinking. And also, 15%, that's a lot of money. I mean, they've got to pay ministers stipends, they've got to look after houses and churches. Why 15%?
Okay, so it is a lot of money, and if we didn't have to ask now, we wouldn't. You couldn't really think of a worse time to have to do this. So be assured that a lot of thought and consideration has gone into this. The Methodist Council gave it a lot of time. Conference gave it very serious consideration. Of course, what we're talking about is the total amount of money available to all churches, circuits and districts. And we know, because of the report that the Central Finance Board gives to conference, that there's about 250 million available to churches, circuits and districts in Central Finance Board accounts. And then we estimate there's about another 50 million sat in ordinary bank accounts, with Lloyds and NatWest and HSBC and so on. So there's £300 million out there somewhere. I don't know where it is, but it is within Methodist churches, circuits and districts. So we know the money is there. And that's far more than we need as a reserve. I mean, it's entirely appropriate to have a reserve. Every church should think about what it needs to put in its back pocket for the future. But 300 million is way over what you might think we need. And it's a number that's remained pretty constant for the last 10 years. We haven't been spending it. Because I think what happens is people spend some of it, but as fast as they spend it, we're selling more mansas and churches. Now, in the long run, that's not really what we want to be doing as a church. It doesn't sound like a sort of growth strategy to be selling everything, but it is the position we're in at the moment, that we're selling, we've got all this money, and then we're not spending it. So we know the money's there. We don't know individually who's got it all. And what we're really saying to everybody is, take a look at this. Do you know what's in your accounts? Do you know how much is held with TMCP and with the CFB? And how much of that in your local setting can you afford to give? So the 15% is a sort of a figure that we would like to collect nationally, but that might not work in a local setting. All your money might be allocated to some brilliant missional project. And I would say amen to that. Go ahead and tell us, no, you're not giving us anything. But actually, we know that from that 300 million, it isn't all being spent on great new missional priorities. So we want people to seriously think about what they can afford to give, and particularly those perhaps who've got a bit more, can they give beyond the 15%? Because we know there'll be others that really can't afford. And of course, at the end of the day, those churches that have no reserves, well, 15% of nothing is nothing.
So you're not talking about what's in the churches and circuits accounts and district accounts at the moment. You're talking about what we've got in reserves.
That's right. Reserves that may have been there just a short time, but for many will have been there for years, maybe even decades. And we're now saying, now is the time. But as you're reviewing what you've got, why not also think about how you are allocating that money to other things? So it's not just about sending money for the pension reserve fund.
Why should they bail out the connection?
Well, I hope people won't see it by that, but I understand the question. When it comes to the ministers scheme, of course, ministers are working throughout the connection and working in their local circuits, and their pension contributions are funded by the circuits. So really it feels like it should be a sort of joint responsibility between the connection and connectional funds and the circuits where ministers are actually based. And of course what the connection is doing in relation to this problem, as well as organising this appeal, of course, is that some of the properties that are owned by the connectional funds, we're sort of offering those to the pension trustees as like a guarantee, as a sort of funding of last resort. If everything else goes wrong and there literally is no money left, we'd have to sell some of our properties. So that's how the connection's sort of contributing to this as well.
So what you're saying is that it's a partnership between all wings of the Methodist Church, not just the local church, but connectional committees, district, circuits. We're all in this together, and we're all trying to do the very best that we can so that our name doesn't end up in the newspapers as those who fail to look after their pensioners.
That's absolutely right, yes.
So what you're saying is if we pay, if the churches and circuits give the required 15% or whatever they can afford out of the reserves, not out of their general money, but out of the reserves that they've put aside that they've not touched for years probably, if we do that now, it would be better for us in the long run. Is that what you're saying, Matt?
Absolutely, yes.
Generous God, we are grateful for the ministry of women and men over many generations in the service of our faith and of our churches. We are grateful for the generosity of our people in all their regular and particular gifts for the work of God in this place. We are grateful that we, once not a people, have been made one people in you and with your Son. And so we ask for you to inspire in us a vision of how, as Christians, we do things differently. We ask you to inspire amongst us a spirit of connectionalism and grace. Give us a vision of your work and enable us to be part of that with ourselves and our resources. Take our gratitude for what has been and turn it into acts of love for our people, our past and our future. We ask these things brought together as one in your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.